Once we unleash the energy of America's businesses and families and individuals, as we did in the 80s and 90s, a booming job market will reduce demand for government assistance, and rising incomes will increase federal revenues. In the 1980s, revenues to the federal government increased by 99%.
Tim Pawlenty, like all the other Republican presidential candidates, pushes the great Republican tax lie that tax cuts actually increase the amount of money the government collects in taxes. Republicans say the federal government will get more by taxing less because lower tax rates will make everyone work harder. They'll want to work harder. They'll make more money than before. The economy will be stimulated, and there will be more money in the total economy subject to taxation. This is now a Republican article of faith.
You cut taxes, and the tax revenues increase.
And the fact is the tax cuts have dramatically increased revenues.
Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell has said, quote, "There's no evidence whatsoever that the Bush tax cuts actually diminished revenue. They increased revenue because of the vibrancy of these tax cuts in the economy." Much ignored by Republican politicians is what Republican economic experts actually think about this. Here is George W. Bush's Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson during his confirmation hearing in 2006.
A general rule, I don't believe that tax cuts pay for themselves.
President Bush's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors was completely ignored when he said this in testimony to the Senate Budget Committee in 2006. Quote, "As a general rule, we do not think tax cuts pay for themselves. Certainly the data do not support this claim." And Alan Greenspan, who was first appointed to the Federal Reserve by President Reagan, said this to David Gregory last year.
You don't agree with Republican leaders who say tax cuts pay for themselves?
They do not.
Joining me now, returning to the show, is Bruce Bartlett, who served as executive director of the Joint Economic Committee, as a senior policy analyst in the Reagan White House, and as a Treasury Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy during the first Bush administration. He is now a columnist for the Fiscal Times and a contributor to the New York Times. Bruce, thanks for joining me again tonight.
Happy to be here.
Tim Pawlenty recently told Dave Weigel, Slate reporter, he said, when Ronald Reagan cut taxes in a significant way, revenues actually increased by almost 100% during Reagan's 8 years as president. You were there. What happened during the 8 years of the Reagan presidency after the Reagan tax cut? What happened to how much revenue we collected?
Look, what Pawlenty said is just factually untrue, and anybody who wants to find out can just go to cbo.gov and look up the data at the Congressional Budget Office website for themselves. The fact is that between fiscal year 1981 and 1989, revenues increased in nominal dollar terms only 65%, but almost a good chunk of that was inflation. If you simply took the 1981 numbers and inflated them to 1989 numbers, the increase was only about 25%. And, of course, the population increased, so on a per capita basis, revenues were only up about 15%. But at the end of the day, what really matters is revenues as a share of GDP, and they were down about a percentage point, which means revenues were about $66 billion lower than they would have been if they had simply stayed constant as a share of GDP.
Bruce, we searched and searched, and we couldn't find anybody in the Reagan administration. We couldn't find any videotape of anyone in the Reagan administration saying these tax cuts will increase revenue to the federal treasury.
Well, that's because nobody in the administration ever said that. If you
go
back,
we'll stop searching then.
If you go back to the documents that the administration sent to Capitol Hill in February 1981, they showed massive revenue losses based on standard revenue estimating methodology. And if you check the CBO reports that came out around that same time, you will find that the CBO, which was then under Democratic control, had almost the same identical estimates. Now, it turned out that revenues came in much lower than anybody expected, but that was mainly because inflation came down much more quickly than anybody expected. And inflation increases the size of the tax base, so lower inflation reduces federal revenues.
The studies that you have pointed out in your writing and others have indicated show that there is an effect. There is a stimulative effect to a tax cut. So if you do say $100 billion in a tax cut, it will not generate $100 billion in new tax revenue, but it might generate as much as $30 billion, maybe $15 billion. There will be some stimulative effect to it, but the net loss is overwhelming. We just heard Mitch McConnell say about the 21st century Bush tax cuts that same magic trick occurred, that Bush cut taxes and we increased revenue. Where did he get that idea?
Well, that's just complete nonsense. I really have no idea what basis he's making that claim. Look, some very special types of tax cuts, such as a cut in the capital gains rate, can come very close to paying for themselves because taxpayers essentially decide for themselves whether to realize income or not. And an across-the-board tax rate reduction may only lose 70% or so of the revenue that a static estimate would show. But there are lots and lots of tax cuts, and there were plenty of them in the Bush tax cuts, refundable child credits and things of that sort, that just lose dollar for dollar revenue and have no feedback effects whatsoever.
Feedback effects are what economists call that effect of the stimulative return to the Treasury. Very small. There's a huge difference between what Republicans are saying is there's a 100% or more feedback effect, and what we've found is way, way, way down into tiny numbers, and in many, many cases, zero. Bruce Bartlett, I could go on and on about this. I cannot thank you enough for coming on tonight and ruining this Republican lie. I hope you can still find some Republican friends in Washington to have dinner with tonight.
All right, I will.
Thank you very much for joining me tonight, Bruce.